The healthcare hero's last day, saving one more life. 4 words that stopped Steve Harvey mid-sentence and transformed a game show studio into something sacred. 4 words that came from the mouth of a 58-year-old man who had spent 35 years in emergency medicine, who had held dying strangers in his arms, who had delivered miracles and heartbreak in equal measure, and who was about to walk away from the only life he'd ever known. But this story doesn't begin with those 4 words. It begins at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March 2020, in the emergency department of Cleveland General Hospital, where Dr. Robert Martinez was losing his 3rd patient of the night to a virus that the world was just beginning to understand. Robert had been an emergency room physician for 35 years. He had seen everything that human beings could do to themselves and each other. Car accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, violence, accidents, and illnesses that struck without warning. He had developed the emotional armor that all emergency doctors must wear. The ability to compartmentalize tragedy, to make life and death decisions without drowning in the weight of their consequences. To move from one crisis to the next without carrying the grief forward. But COVID-19 had broken something in him that he didn't know could be broken. For 18 months, Robert had watched more people die than in his previous 33 years of practice combined. He had worked shifts that stretched beyond exhaustion, treating patients who couldn't breathe while he wondered if he would be next. He had held iPads so that dying patients could say goodbye to families who weren't allowed in the hospital. He had made phone calls to spouses and children and parents, telling them that their loved ones were gone. Most of all, he had saved fewer people than he had lost. And for a man whose identity was built on healing, on being the one who brought people back from the brink of death, the mathematics of the pandemic had been devastating. The breaking point had come with Maria Santos, a 34-year-old teacher and mother of 2 young children. She had arrived at the emergency department on a ventilator from another hospital, her case transferred to Cleveland General because they had one of the last available ICU beds in the city. Robert had spent 14 hours fighting for Maria's life. He had tried every treatment protocol, consulted with specialists across the country, pushed his own body to the limits of endurance. But at 3:47 a.m., Maria Santos had died, and Robert had been the one to call her husband to tell him that their children no longer had a mother. After that phone call, Robert had walked into the hospital bathroom, looked at himself in the mirror, and realized he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The face was too thin, the eyes too hollow, the expression too haunted. He looked like someone who had seen too much death and lost too much faith in his ability to prevent it. That morning, Robert had submitted his retirement paperwork. After 35 years of saving lives, he was done. The decision had been met with shock from his colleagues, understanding from his wife Carmen, and confusion from his 2 adult children, who had grown up proud of their father's calling but had never fully understood the weight he carried. "Dad, you're only 58, his daughter Elena had said during the family dinner where he'd announced his decision. "You could practice for another 10 years. "I could," Robert had replied, stirring his food around his plate without eating it. "But I shouldn't. I don't trust myself anymore. When you stop believing you can save people, it's time to stop trying." His son Miguel, who had followed in his father's footsteps and was completing his medical residency in pediatrics, had been more direct. "Dad, this is just burnout. Take a sabbatical. Get some therapy. Don't throw away your entire career because of one bad stretch." But Robert knew it wasn't just burnout. It was something deeper, something that had been broken by watching too many people die, despite his best efforts. He had lost the faith that was essential to emergency medicine, the belief that he could make a difference, that his skills and knowledge and determination could tip the balance between life and death in favor of life. The Family Feud audition had been Carmen's idea. She had found the application online and filled it out without telling Robert, including their children and Robert's brother Carlos in the plan. Her reasoning was simple. Robert needed something to remind him of joy, of family, of the reasons that life was worth living and saving. Under Why Should Your Family Be Chosen? Carmen had written, "Because our family represents what my husband has spent 35 years fighting for: love, laughter, and the celebration of life. Robert Martinez has saved thousands of lives as an emergency physician, and now his family wants to save him by reminding him that heroes deserve happiness too." When they had received the acceptance call, Robert had initially refused to participate. The idea of being on television, of pretending to be happy and carefree when he felt hollowed out by grief and exhaustion, seemed impossible. But Elena had convinced him. "Dad, you've spent your entire adult life taking care of other people. Let us take care of you for once. Let us show you what you mean to us." The taping was scheduled for Robert's last day of work. He had specifically requested to work one final shift before retiring, wanting to end his career the way it had begun, in service to patients who needed him. The show's producers had been accommodating, scheduling the evening taping to allow Robert to complete his final day as an emergency physician. That last shift had been both routine and profound. Robert had treated a construction worker with a broken arm, a teenager with appendicitis, an elderly woman having a panic attack, and a new mother with postpartum complications. Standard cases, the kind of medical problems that emergency physicians handle every day. But each patient had felt significant to Robert because he knew they were his last. The construction worker had thanked him profusely, not knowing that Robert was questioning whether he deserved thanks for anything. The teenager had asked if Robert thought he'd be okay, not knowing that Robert no longer trusted his ability to predict who would be okay and who wouldn't. The elderly woman had held his hand and told him he was an angel, not knowing that Robert felt like a failure. The new mother had been the hardest case of his final day. She had come in with symptoms that could have indicated several different conditions, ranging from minor complications to life-threatening emergencies. Robert had run the appropriate tests, consulted with specialists, and ultimately determined that she was experiencing normal postpartum recovery, complicated by anxiety and sleep deprivation. As he had discharged her with instructions for follow-up care and reassurance that she and her baby would be fine, Robert had been struck by a realization: this was what he was good at. Not just the medical knowledge, but the ability to provide comfort and certainty to people in their most vulnerable moments. The mother had left the hospital calm and confident, trusting in his assessment and grateful for his care. But instead of feeling proud of his work, Robert had felt a profound sadness that this skill, this calling, this part of his identity was ending. The Martinez family had gathered at the studio that evening with a mixture of excitement and concern. Carmen had watched her husband throughout the day, recognizing the signs of someone going through the motions of normalcy while dealing with profound internal conflict. Elena and Miguel had been more optimistic, hoping that the shared experience of being on television together might help their father remember who he was, beyond his role as a doctor. When Steve Harvey had called them onto the stage for the family introduction, Robert had felt disconnected from his surroundings. The bright lights, the enthusiastic audience, the game show energy, it all felt surreal after spending the day in the sterile, serious environment of the emergency department. And here we have the Martinez family from Cleveland, Ohio. Steve had announced with his signature enthusiasm. "Tell me about your family, Robert." Robert had stepped forward, still wearing the mental uniform of his profession, even though he had changed into civilian clothes. "We're here because my family believes I need reminding that there's more to life than work. I was an emergency room doctor for 35 years, and tomorrow I'm retiring." Steve had picked up on the hesitation in Robert's voice, the way he had corrected himself from "I'm" to "I was." Years of hosting had taught him to recognize the stories behind the words people chose. 35 years in the emergency room, Steve had repeated, his tone shifting to something more respectful, more serious. "That's a calling, not just a job. What made you decide to retire?" Robert had looked at his family, all of them encouraging him with their eyes, and had made a decision to be honest. "I stopped believing I was making a difference. In my line of work, if you don't believe you can save people, you shouldn't be doing it." The audience had fallen quiet. This wasn't the typical light-hearted family introduction they were accustomed to. Carmen had stepped closer to her husband, taking his hand in a gesture of support that everyone in the studio could see. Elena had spoken next. Our dad has saved thousands of lives. He worked through the pandemic when everyone else was staying home. He's a hero, even if he doesn't feel like one right now. The game had progressed with the Martinez family playing against the Thompson family from Detroit. Robert had participated, contributing answers when called upon, but his heart wasn't fully in the competition. His family had compensated for his distraction with enthusiasm and solid gameplay, and they had managed to advance to the final round. But it was during the fourth round that everything changed. The category was named Something You'll Miss When You Retire. The Thompson family had just played their turn with answers like coworkers, steady paycheck, and daily routine, standard retirement concerns that had earned them decent points but nothing spectacular. It was Robert's turn at the podium. Throughout the game he had been competent but subdued, answering questions correctly but without the energy and engagement that made for great television. But now, facing this particular question on his last day as a physician, something shifted in his expression. He wasn't just a contestant anymore. He was a man confronting the end of the only identity he had ever known, trying to articulate what it meant to walk away from a calling that had defined him for more than half his life. "Robert," Steve said, "for the points your family needs, name something you'll miss when you retire." Robert stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edge, as he considered the question. He thought about his colleagues, the adrenaline rush of emergency medicine, the satisfaction of diagnostic challenges solved. But as he stood there, under the bright lights, surrounded by the energy of the game show, he realized that none of those things were what he would actually miss. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the studio with the weight of 35 years of medical practice and the profound loss he was feeling as it ended. Saving one more life. The words hung in the air like a prayer unanswered. Steve's expression changed completely. The entertainer's mask slipped away, revealing something deeper, more human. He understood immediately that this wasn't just a game show answer. This was the confession of a man whose entire sense of purpose had been built on being able to make the ultimate difference in people's lives. "Dr. Martinez," Steve said, and the use of his title was intentional, respectful, an acknowledgement of who Robert was, beyond the game show context. "That's not just an answer. That's a lifetime of service." The board revealed that it wasn't there. The survey hadn't captured something so specific, so personal, so fameux, but something had shifted in the studio. The audience wasn't thinking about points anymore. The Thompson family wasn't focused on winning. Everyone was looking at Robert, who was standing very still at the podium, processing the weight of his own words. "Tell me about that," Steve said gently. And it wasn't a request from a host to a consent. It was an invitation from one human being to another, who clearly had something important to say. Robert took a breath and looked out at the studio audience, then at his family, then back at Steve. "For 35 years, every day I went to work. I knew that I might be the difference between someone living or dying. That's an incredible responsibility, and an incredible privilege. And in the last year and a half, I've watched too many people die despite everything I could do for them." His voice began to break slightly. "I started to question whether I was actually saving people or just prolonging their suffering. Whether I was a healer or just someone who was pretending to be one while people died anyway." Steve walked closer to Robert, abandoning his host position entirely. "Doctor, how many lives do you think you've saved in 35 years? "I don't know," Robert replied. "Thousands, maybe. But in the pandemic, I lost more people than I saved. And when you're used to being the person who brings people back from the edge, losing it breaks something in you." Carmen was crying now. Elena and Miguel were holding each other. The studio audience was completely silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something much more important than entertainment. "Can I tell you something, Dr. Martinez?" Steve said, and his voice carried a gravity that transcended television. Every person in this studio, every person watching at home, has been touched by someone like you. Someone who chose to spend their life fighting for other people's lives. Steve turned to address the entire studio. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone in this audience to stand up. Not because I'm telling you to, but because Dr. Robert Martinez represents everyone who has ever put their life on the line to save someone else's. The audience rose as one, not with the typical game show enthusiasm, but with something deeper: recognition, gratitude, respect. The applause that followed wasn't entertainment applause. It was the sound of hundreds of people acknowledging someone who had dedicated his life to service. But Steve wasn't finished. He walked back to Robert, who was now openly emotional, overwhelmed by the unexpected outpouring of recognition. "Doctor, I need you to understand something," Steve said. "You said you stopped believing you could save people. But look around this studio. Look at your family. Look at the respect everyone here has for what you've done with your life. You've been saving people for 35 years, and you just saved something in all of us by reminding us what real heroism looks like." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his business card, but then seemed to think better of it. Instant, he took off his suit jacket, the same jacket that had become part of his television persona, and draped it over Robert's shoulders. "This jacket has been with me for every show, every family, every moment of celebration and heartbreak that's happened on this stage," Steve said. "And I want the man who has spent 35 years saving lives to have it, because you've earned the right to be celebrated." Robert, now wearing Steve's oversized jacket, looked small and vulnerable and incredibly dignified all at the same time. He turned toward his family, and Carmen, Elena, and Miguel rushed from their positions to embrace him at the podium. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Elena whispered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. "Not because of how many lives you've saved, but because of who you are." Miguel added, "You taught me that being a doctor isn't about being perfect. It's about caring enough to try, even when you can't win." But it was Carmen who delivered the words that would be remembered forever. "Roberto, you haven't stopped being a healer. You've just learned that sometimes the person who needs healing the most is the healer himself." That's when Steve Harvey did something unprecedented in Family Feud history. He turned to the Thompson family and asked them to join the Martinez family on stage. Then he addressed both families and the entire studio. "Tonight, we're not going to have a winner and a loser," Steve announced. "Tonight, we're going to have a celebration, because Martinez has reminded us that some things are more important than points, more important than prizes, more important than anything except the recognition that heroes walk among us every day." The two families stood together on the stage, united not in competition, but in the acknowledgement of something larger than themselves. The Martinez family surrounded Robert, and the Thompson family added their support, creating a circle of respect and gratitude around a man who had spent his career creating circles of care around his patients. Steve addressed the studio and the cameras one final time. "Dr. Robert Martinez is retiring tomorrow after 35 years of saving lives, and while he may not believe he made a difference, everyone who has ever been brought back from the brink of death by someone like him knows better. Heroes don't always get to see the impact they've made. Sometimes they just have to trust that it was real." The episode aired exactly as it happened, unedited, 6 weeks later. It became one of the highest-rate Family Feud episodes in the show's history, not because of dramatic television, but because viewers recognized something authentic in a world that often feels disconnected from real heroism. More importantly, it sparked conversations about healthcare worker burnout, about the psychological toll of the pandemic on medical professionals, and about the need to support those who have dedicated their lives to saving others. Robert Martinez did retire the next day, as planned. But something had changed during his Family Feud appearance. The recognition, the gratitude, the reminder of why his work had mattered. It hadn't erased his grief over the patients he couldn't save, but it had restored his faith in the value of the patients he had saved. The weeks following the taping were a period of adjustment. Without the structure of hospital shifts, without the constant adrenaline of emergency medicine, he found himself struggling with the sudden absence of purpose. Carmen watched him carefully, recognizing the signs of a man learning to live without the identity that had defined him for 3.5 decades. But something was different this time. Instead of hollow despair, Robert seemed to be processing his grief rather than drowning in it. He began talking to Carmen about specific patients he remembered, not just the ones he had lost, but the ones he had saved. "Do you remember Mrs. Patterson?" he asked Carmen one evening. "Heart attack in our parking lot. I worked on her for 23 minutes. Everyone else thought we should call it, but something told me to keep trying. She lived 14 more years after that night." 6 months later, Robert began volunteering at a free clinic in an underserved part of Cleveland. He worked 2 days a week, treating patients who couldn't afford regular medical care, using his skills in a setting where every person helped was a clear victory. The first patient he saved at the clinic was Maria Rodriguez, a woman who had been ignoring chest pain for 3 weeks because she couldn't afford to miss work. Robert recognized the signs of a heart attack in progress and immediately arranged for her transport to the hospital. When Maria returned for follow-up care, she brought her 3 children to meet Robert. "This man saved my life," she told them. "Doctor, my children wanted to meet the angel who made sure their mama would be here for their graduation." Standing in that small clinic examination room, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the pure, uncomplicated satisfaction of having made an unambiguous difference in someone's life. He also began speaking to medical students about burnout, about the importance of self-care, about the difference between failing patients and losing patients to circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Raising your hand to become a physician," he told first-year students, "is volunteering to carry other people's pain. That's part of the job. But you can't carry it all forever without help. The moment you start believing that every patient death is your personal failure is the moment you start losing your ability to help the patients you can save." Elena completed her residency in family medicine and now practices at a community health center, inspired by her father's example but determined to maintain better boundaries between her professional and personal life. Miguel specialized in pediatric emergency medicine, following in his father's footsteps, but with a more sustainable approach to the emotional demands of the work. He was active in his hospital's physician wellness program and regularly attended counseling sessions. Carmen says that her husband is a different person now, still the compassionate, dedicated man she married, but no longer carrying the impossible burden of believing he could save everyone. He sleeps better, laughs more easily, and has rediscovered joy in medicine by practicing it on his own terms. The business card Steve had started to give Robert that night was never exchanged, but Steve did visit Robert at the free clinic several months later. He came not with television cameras, but with a personal desire to see how the man he had met on his stage was doing. "You found your way back," Steve told Robert during that visit. "Not to being the same doctor you were before, but to being the doctor you were meant to be." Robert had smiled at that assessment, recognizing its truth. He wasn't the emergency physician he had been in his 30s and 40s, when he could work 36-hour shifts and compartmentalize every trauma he witnessed. But he was a more complete healer now, someone who understood both the power and the limitations of medicine. Today, when Robert Martinez introduces himself, he no longer hesitates between "I am" and "I was" a doctor. He is a healer, working within his limits, saving the lives he can save, and accepting with grace the lives he cannot. He has learned that heroism isn't about winning every battle. It's about showing up for the fight, again and again, with compassion and skill and hope. The free clinic where Robert volunteers has expanded its services, partly due to his influence and connections within the Cleveland medical community. Other retired physicians have joined the volunteer staff, creating a model for how experienced doctors can continue practicing medicine in sustainable ways. Robert has also become a mentor to younger physicians who are struggling with burnout, He meets regularly with residents and physicians who are questioning their calling, sharing his story and helping them understand that professional crisis can be a pathway to renewal. The answer Robert gave that night never made it onto the board, but it made it into the hearts of healthcare workers around the country who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can save is your own sense of purpose, your own faith in the healing work, your own belief that making a difference is still possible even when you can't make every difference you hoped for. Saving one more life. 4 words that captured the essence of what it means to be called to medicine. Not the guarantee that every patient will survive, but the unwavering commitment to try, with everything you have, to give each person the best possible chance. And sometimes the life you save is your own. That's what Dr. Robert Martinez taught America that night. That's what his family taught him. That's what healing really means when it's working the way it's supposed to work. Not perfect, not without loss, but sustained by hope and guided by wisdom earned through a lifetime of dedicated service to others.